You became easier to use. That shift was subtle. But everyone around you felt it before you did. You answered fast, stayed late, fixed problems, covered gaps, and made chaos look manageable without asking for much. What you're experiencing has a name, helpfulness drift, when generosity gets recoded as permanent availability instead of professional value. In the next few minutes, I'll decode why this happens, how teams exploit it, and what respect actually attracts. The first sign is usually invisible. People stop asking whether you can help and start assuming you will. But the real loss starts later, when your usefulness grows faster than your authority and nobody says it directly. You notice it in meetings first, especially when your ideas get accepted only after someone else repeats them. You became the person who smooths tension, remembers deadlines, answers Slack, and rescues half-finished work without credit. People call you amazing, dependable, a lifesaver, and essential, while quietly deciding you exist to absorb inconvenience. That is why helpful women often feel appreciated and diminished at the same time, because those signals arrive together. Imagine this. You stay late fixing a deck. The next morning, leadership praises the team and skips your name. Or your manager says, "You're so great in a crisis," while assigning another high-visibility project to someone louder. If this sounds like you're weak, you're not paranoid. You're noticing the difference between gratitude and status. Gratitude is temporary. Status decides whose time gets protected, whose opinions travel upward, and whose mistakes get interpreted generously. Helpful employees often receive the language of appreciation without the structure of respect, and that distinction changes careers. Here is the mechanism underneath it. Workplaces reward what appears scarce, not what appears endlessly available. The more reliably you solve invisible problems, the less those problems look expensive to the people benefiting from them. Your effort gets absorbed into normal operations, and normal operations rarely generate prestige unless failure becomes suddenly visible. That is why constant rescuing can weaken your perceived leverage, even when your actual contribution keeps rising. What looked like kindness to you may be read as low-boundary labor by managers tracking who can be stretched. In many teams, helpfulness gets sorted into personality instead of performance, which means it stops counting as strategic impact. You're no longer seen as choosing to help. You're seen as someone whose role naturally includes emotional and operational cleanup. That shift matters during calibration meetings, promotion cycles, succession planning, and stack ranking, where narratives beat effort. Nobody says, "She handled everyone's messes." They say, "She's solid support," which sounds positive and ranks lower. Support is respected only when paired with scarcity, disability, or formal authority. Otherwise, it gets treated like background infrastructure. But here's what's worse. The more competent you look, the more others protect themselves through your labor. Coworkers route ambiguity toward you. Managers postpone decisions because they trust you'll stabilize the fallout before leadership notices. Soon your competence is being used to preserve other people's image management, not to expand your own influence. That is why being helpful can feel strangely humiliating, even when nobody is openly rude to you. The disrespect is often procedural, not dramatic, slower replies, less context, smaller invites, thinner explanations, softer exclusion. You get copied after decisions. You hear about reorgs late. Your skip level suddenly knows less about your work. What you thought was forgetfulness is often hierarchy protecting attention for people already seen as future leaders. Helpful women are frequently judged as reliable enough to use, but not forceful enough to center when power gets allocated. You can hear it in phrases like, "She always steps up," which sounds like respect but often means boundary access. Or, "We know we can count on you," which sometimes translates to, "We don't need consent every time." This is where the pattern reveals itself. Respect falls when your labor feels automatic, emotional, and conveniently unbillable. Especially in hybrid work, invisible support compounds fast because Slack responsiveness starts substituting for leadership presence. You answer instantly, summarize decisions, calm friction, and carry tone for the whole team while others protect focus. Then performance reviews arrive, and suddenly the language shifts toward executive presence, strategic thinking, and greater ownership. Tell me in the comments if you've ever been praised constantly while still being bypassed for visibility or advancement. And tell me which phrase you hear most: dependable, collaborative, supportive, flexible, or not quite leadership material. That answer matters because those words often signal the exact box your workplace has quietly built around you. If you want more decoding like this, stay with me, because the next layer explains why saying yes keeps compounding. The compounding happens through expectation memory, which is the private record teams build about who absorbs pressure without protest. Every time you rescue a deadline, you don't just solve today's problem, you train tomorrow's assumptions about your availability. That is why a single generous act rarely hurts you, but repeated rescue work quietly rewrites your organizational identity. Now people stop evaluating the request, they evaluate your compliance pattern, and that becomes more predictive than your title. Managers especially notice who saves them from escalation because those employees reduce political cost without requiring reciprocal protection. So your helpfulness becomes a buffer between leadership anxiety and operational reality, which sounds valuable and still lowers respect. Why? Because buffers are supposed to absorb impact quietly, and quiet absorption rarely looks like power inside organizations. Imagine this. A launch slips. You spend Friday night fixing dependencies. Monday's meeting frames the recovery as seamless teamwork. No lie was spoken, but the truth was blurred enough that your sacrifice became atmosphere instead of evidence. This is also why women who set one overdue boundary often trigger outsized reactions from managers or coworkers. The team wasn't just expecting help, they had already built future convenience around access to your labor. When you interrupt that access, people experience it as loss, unfairness, or attitude, even if your boundary is normal. That is the origin of soft retaliation: colder tone, delayed approvals, selective silence, and concern packaged like professionalism. Someone says, "I just want to make sure we're aligned," right after you stop doing unpaid cleanup work. Or your manager says, "Let's watch for collaboration," when what actually changed is that you stopped overfunctioning. If this sounds familiar, use a neutral line. "Thanks for the feedback. I'll think about it." Another useful phrase is, "Can you put that in writing for me?" especially when expectations suddenly become slippery. Written language forces vague pressure into concrete terms, and concrete terms are much easier to evaluate and defend. Here's what to watch for next. Your workload stays heavy, but the work becomes harder to translate into advancement. You handle onboarding, tone repair, follow-ups, documentation, client soothing, and informal mentoring that keeps everyone else efficient. Yet none of it sounds impressive during talent reviews unless someone powerful chooses to narrate it properly. So the reward for helpfulness becomes more dependency, while the reward for visible boundary setting becomes respect mixed with risk. This is the cruel geometry many women feel. Being needed is not the same as being valued. Needed people are consumed. Valued people are consulted, protected, and developed before serious crises happen. That distinction becomes especially sharp during layoffs, RIF planning, reorgs, and budget pressure, when narratives get brutally efficient. The highly helpful employee can be framed as supportive but replaceable because support work has already been normalized. Meanwhile, the person who protected scope, signaled scarcity, and attached their name to outcomes looks harder to lose. That doesn't mean becoming cold. It means understanding that organizations measure boundaries as information about self-positioning. People infer value from what you refuse, how selectively you engage, and whether your effort appears directed or endless. So if you help everyone equally, you flatten your own importance inside systems that rank through asymmetry. What looked like fairness is often self-erasure, especially when your strongest work keeps leaving your name behind. Use another grounded phrase here. "I want to make sure I understand. Could you clarify the metric?" If the answer stays fuzzy, that fuzziness is data, especially before performance reviews, picks, or manager resets. Helpful employees are often managed through mood and implication because mood is harder to contest than a written standard. A manager who benefits from your flexibility may never want crisp criteria, since crisp criteria limit convenient redistribution. That is why tactical calm matters more than emotional persuasion when you sense respect slipping around your role. You do not need a big confrontation. You need pattern recognition, documentation, and cleaner control over access. Try to sign in meetings. I'll check my notes and circle back when pressured to volunteer instantly. It interrupts the reflex to overhelp, creates decision space, and reminds others your labor is not public property. Another strong sense is, I prefer to discuss this when we have more time, especially during performative ambushes. That protects you from being cornered into unpaid emotional labor disguised as spontaneity, collaboration, or just quick alignment. But here's the deeper layer most women miss. Overhelping can become a reputation trap long after circumstances change. Even when you become more senior, people may keep approaching you like support staff because memory lags behind growth. They still bring logistics, feelings, and cleanup tasks while routing strategy, sponsorship, and visibility somewhere else. This is why many accomplished women feel oddly junior in rooms where they are objectively carrying the operation. Their authority is being diluted by a reputation built during earlier seasons of overaccommodation and uncredited rescue. To reverse that, stop broadcasting unlimited responsiveness and start attaching yourself to priorities, outcomes, and explicit trade-offs. When asked for help, evaluate the request against visibility, reciprocity, timing, and whether it advances your actual role. You are allowed to help selectively. Selectivity is not selfishness. It is how adults signal structure in political systems. A useful response sounds like this: I can review this tomorrow, or I can finish the client summary today. That sentence does something important. It makes the cost visible, and visible cost is the beginning of respect. Respect grows when your effort is seen as chosen, bounded, and connected to consequences others cannot casually offload. So let some friction become legible. Not drama, just reality. Reality is often the strongest correction available. Document recurring favors. Track invisible labor. Save Slack messages where urgency appears only after someone delayed their own part. Bring that pattern into performance conversations through outcomes, not resentment, because resentment gets dismissed faster than evidence. Say, I've noticed I'm frequently covering cross-team gaps that affect delivery. I'd like to discuss scope and priorities. That language is calm, specific, and hard to caricature as emotional, difficult, or insufficiently collaborative. And if someone still punishes clarity, the punishment is information about the system, not proof he spoke badly. Because healthy leadership does not need you to stay vaguely available in order to feel secure or respected. It values contribution without requiring self-erasure, and it does not confuse access to you with ownership over you. So ask yourself something sharp. Where in your workplace has helpfulness become the price of being seen as good? And where has that price quietly risen until your competence is financing other people's comfort, speed, or image? If this pattern is happening around you, tell me what it looks like in your office, team, or Slack. If this gives language to something you've been feeling, subscribe and turn on the notification bell for future breakdowns. Because once you recognize the pattern, you stop mistaking overuse for appreciation and politeness for respect. Being helpful is not the problem. Becoming endlessly accessible to people who convert your usefulness into permission is. The moment your help stops being assumed, your value starts becoming visible in plain sight again. And that is the line to remember. Respect rises the second your labor stops feeling like something they can take.